Now on BBC One The News with Jane Hill.
Today at 1, the Prime Minister says his target of reducing NHS waiting lists is in doubt, blaming striking doctors. His comments come as the number of patients waiting to start routine hospital treatment hits a record high in England, almost 7.7 million.
With industrial action, it's very hard to continue to meet these targets. But what I would say is we are making very good progress despite industrial action.
We'll ask what the PM's comments mean for patients. Also on the programme. Thousands of people could have been saved from Libya's devastating flooding, says the UN, as fears grow that 20,000 have died. 2 women arrested during a vigil for Sarah Everard on Clapham Common receive substantial damages from the Metropolitan Police. And rumours of the death of cash are greatly exaggerated. Payments with notes and coins rose last year.
On BBC London, we'll have more on the Met payout to the 2 women arrested on Clapham Common at the Sarah Everard vigil. And a sinkhole has appeared in the middle of the road in Eltham, in south-east London.
Hello, welcome to the BBC News at 1. In the last hour, the Prime Minister has acknowledged that his target of reducing NHS waiting lists is in doubt. His comments come as it's revealed that the number of people waiting to start routine hospital treatment in England has risen to a new record high. An estimated 7.68 million people were waiting at the end of July. The Prime Minister called that figure obviously disappointing, but said industrial action by doctors was a significant cause. Our health correspondent Dominic Hughes has all the latest from Salford this lunchtime. Dominic.
Yeah, good afternoon, Jane. So, waiting lists hitting nearly 7.7 million people in England. That represents around 1 in 7 of the population. Now, this morning, the Prime Minister, as you said, Rishi Sunak, has acknowledged that those figures are, as he said, obviously disappointing. And he has admitted really for the first time that his target of reducing waiting times in England was now in doubt and that it would be very hard to meet that. And you have to say that with the context of increasing demand, ongoing industrial action and ongoing staff shortages in the health service, it's very hard to argue with that argument. Even before the pandemic hit, NHS waiting times have been growing month on month. Now they've reached record levels, nearly 7.7 million people waiting for routine hospital procedures, including hip and knee operations. Some are also facing long waits for the treatment of more serious conditions, and it's having a profound impact on their lives.
I think individually everybody's doing their best, and I can sometimes sense the frustration.
Andrea needs a heart operation. She's already faced long delays for important tests and is now living with the anxiety and stress of waiting for surgery.
I haven't worked since the end of April, and I don't get statutory sick pay because I'm on short-term contracts as a supply teacher, and I'm also partly self-employed. So, yes, I'm living off my savings at the moment until they run out. There's so much being lost from the labour force. You know, all these people who are waiting for operations can't be doing other things. But actually, for me, the biggest thing has been the time and frustration and the stress.
What do we want? How do we get it?
Ministers point to the impact of the series of strikes by NHS staff since December last year, which has meant that close to 1 million appointments and treatments have been postponed. Junior doctors and their consultant colleagues are set for further industrial action next week.
Wow, hello. How are you all doing?
The rising number of people waiting for treatment threatens the Prime Minister's pledge to bring down waiting lists. At North Devon District Hospital this morning, Rishi Sunak, who's just announced an extra £200 million to help the NHS in England get through winter, said there were signs of improvement.
Well, with industrial action, it's very hard to continue to meet these targets. But what I would say is we are making very good progress despite industrial action. Last year, we virtually eliminated the number of people waiting 2 years for treatment. And earlier this year, we practically eliminated the number of people waiting 1.5 years. Now, those were interim steps that we had. We have delivered those, and we're delivering a record amount of care. But industrial action obviously makes meeting these targets very challenging.
While waiting lists were growing long before strike action was announced, NHS leaders say they pose a real danger heading into winter, and the mood is one of frustration.
There's hardly been a let-up since the pandemic. NHS staff are pulling out all the stops to deliver, but it really is difficult at the moment with rising admissions, potential uptick in flu, COVID, heading into winter, with this drag anchor of industrial action that everyone really wants to see resolved.
NHS bosses will welcome the extra government money as they head into what will be another tough winter. But the big underlying problems facing the health service, waiting lists, a shortage of staff and the ongoing industrial unrest are still very much with us. Dominic Hughes, BBC News.
And our political correspondent, Layla Nathu, joins me as well. So these comments from Rishi Sunak, just how significant is that concession, Layla?
Well, I think it's a bit of a shift, Jane. I mean, it's certainly the most pessimistic, I think, that we have seen Rishi Sunak about this specific target. But he makes it very clear that he's linking stalled progress on this particular target on NHS waiting lists to the ongoing industrial action. We'd heard him earlier in the summer make that link before that ongoing industrial action was stalling progress towards bringing those waiting lists down. But I think today is a bit more of an acknowledgement that the industrial action, he thinks, is having more of an impact and is going to perhaps cast doubt over whether he's going to fulfil those promises. Remember, it was one of the 5 pledges he made at the start of the year to voters, asking him to judge him and hold him to account on. And I think we're hearing from him today that he thinks at least one of them is in doubt.
Layla Nathu, thank you. Most of the thousands of people who died in Libya's catastrophic floods could have been saved if early warning systems had worked properly, according to the United Nations. The head of the UN's World Meteorological Organization said people could have been moved to safety if emergency management systems had been in place. There are fears that the death toll could reach 20,000 after a tsunami-sized flash flood hit the east of the country at the weekend. Joe Inwood has the latest.
Derna is a city overwhelmed. First, overwhelmed by the water that brought such terrible damage. Then overwhelmed by the scale of the humanitarian catastrophe the flooding has caused. And finally, overwhelmed by grief at the loss of life.
God give me patience. My heart is with you. This man cries as he sees the body of his young son. It's now becoming clearer that this was a natural disaster, but enabled by human actions. The Wadi Derna River had 2 dams, both failed. The upper one, 10 kilometres from the town, had a capacity of about 1.5 million cubic metres of water. When that burst, that water, with a weight of about 1.5 million tonnes, rushed to the sea, sweeping the second dam and about a quarter of the city with it.
We had warned the authorities since last week, no, for years, that the dam had cracks and needs to be maintained. We said it and nobody listened to us, and now the whole of Derna is flooded.
It is not just for the maintenance of the dam that the authorities are being criticised. The head of the UN Meteorological Organization says most of the deaths could have been avoided if warnings had been given. But the politicians and warlords who have tried and failed to run this country since the fall of the dictator Muammar Gaddafi will want to avoid taking the blame.
It has been an enormous shock, and I don't want to point the blame at anyone or create controversy. Even if all measures had been taken, there would have been losses, massive losses.
While the overwhelming majority of victims will be Libyans, others were caught up in the disaster. 74 Egyptians, all from the same town, were swept out to sea. I've lost 4 members of my family, Hassan says. My son called his brother last Thursday for the last time, telling him that he will get clothes for the children. Oh, my dear son, he finishes. International aid is starting to arrive. But the same crumbling infrastructure that allowed this disaster to happen also prevents the help getting through. It is hard to comprehend the full scale of this tragedy. The force of nature and the failings of government saw entire families, entire communities, simply washed into the sea. Joe Inwood, BBC News.
It's emerged that a Russian military pilot tried to shoot down an RAF surveillance aircraft which had dozens of British military personnel on board last September. The BBC has learnt that the pilot released 2 missiles after he thought he'd been given permission to fire. Our defence correspondent Jonathan Beale is with me. So what on earth happened here, Jonathan?
Well, the RAF have been conducting these surveillance missions in international airspace over the Black Sea since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The Rivet joint, the aircraft we're talking about, an RAF spy plane, can suck up intelligence, and the crew of up to 30 would have been able to listen to the communications that could potentially have led to their deaths. Now, this is what we now know happened. 2 Russian aircraft jets were sent to intercept the RAF spy plane. One of the pilots thought he had permission to open fire. He fired a missile, an air-to-air missile, which didn't lock on to his target and thankfully missed. There was then a row between the 2 pilots. The second pilot didn't think he had permission to fire, yet that first pilot then fired a second missile, released a second missile, which just dropped from the aircraft. Now, of course, the UK went to Russia, said, what is the explanation? Russia said it was a technical malfunction. The UK officially accepted that explanation, even though it knew much more. The US said it was a near shoot down. Why wasn't the UK more open about what happened? Well, I think 2 reasons. First of all, they didn't want to tell the Russians all their intelligence gathering capabilities. And the second reason, they didn't want the situation to escalate. This could have led to a military confrontation. In the end, nobody was killed. Thankfully, RAF surveillance planes now are escorted by fighter jets.
Jonathan Beale, thank you. The Metropolitan Police has paid damages to 2 women who were arrested at the Clapham Common Vigil for Sarah Everard in 2021. Patsy Stevenson and Dania Al-Obeid took legal action against the force following the gathering that was held during COVID restrictions. Here's Lucy Manning.
A picture that shocked. A woman pinned down, handcuffed by Met police officers at a vigil for Sarah Everard, murdered and raped by a Met officer. Patsy Stevenson was arrested that night. Dania Al-Obeid was also arrested at the vigil for breaking COVID restrictions. Today the Met has agreed to pay the women damages and says it regrets what happened.
We were blamed for, going there, for the arrest itself. Our motivations were constantly questioned. We were told that we hijacked the event. So to get some sort of recognition that we are allowed to be angry for the murder and rape of a woman by a serving officer, it's kind of like, okay, we actually feel seen and heard somewhat, and it gives us that sense of validation and our sanity back.
Hundreds of women gathered in March 2 years ago on Clapham Common to remember Sarah Everard, but the police claimed lockdown restrictions meant they had to clear the area. Too abusive, claimed women there.
Shame on you! Shame on you!
I was putting a candle down for Sarah. A woman held her hand out and asked me to come up to the bandstand to help. The police were very heavy-handed with a lot of women. We just didn't expect to be arrested. I just wanted to show my support for other women.
It sounds like it's still really distressing for you to talk about.
Yeah. I think it's been a huge part of my life for the past 2.5 years.
As Dania listened, she realised she was the woman who Patsy was describing trying to help as police moved in.
I just found out she was the woman putting her hand out and I didn't even know. I didn't know that was you. Oh my God.
You said it there and it clicked. We never really spoke about it.
We didn't know each other before the vigil.
So I held my hand out and she we grabbed each other's arms and she climbed over with me, and then we put our arms around each other.
And you've only just realised
Yeah.
now?
Just realised, yeah.
We've never really spoken about it because we haven't been allowed to, so...
But despite the payout, the women still feel the Met hasn't properly apologised, just expressing regret, and it says its officers acted in good faith. Lucy Manning, BBC News.
That's a lot, that's a lot.
4 Metropolitan Police officers are to face disciplinary proceedings in relation to the strip search of a 15-year-old schoolgirl known as Child Q. It's claimed the girl, who had her period at the time of the incident, was discriminated against because of her race and sex. Our community affairs correspondent Adina Campbell has been following the story. Bring us right up to date, Adina.
Well, this was a case which caused a huge public outcry at the time, widespread protests and urgent questions in Parliament. Child Q had been wrongly suspected of carrying cannabis. She was on her period at the time and there was no appropriate adult present when the search took place. Her family say that she was left traumatised and the Metropolitan Police did apologise afterwards. In terms of what's happened today, while this is a fairly significant development, 4 Metropolitan Police officers are now facing disciplinary proceedings, and the watchdog, the Independent Office of Police Conduct, well, they've asked the Metropolitan Police to consider sending formal letters of apology to the girl and her mother.
Adina Campbell, thank you. The time is 16 minutes past 1. Our top story this afternoon. The Prime Minister says his target of reducing NHS waiting lists is in doubt, blaming striking doctors. Still to come here, how a river in Somerset is rerouted to help deal with the impact of climate change.
And on BBC London, the hidden power station in the middle of the city. We take a look inside. And the heatwave may be over, but is more sunshine on the way? We'll have the weather forecast with Elizabeth Rizzini.
The family of a Colombian man who's believed to have taken his own life at a Heathrow immigration removal centre earlier this year has told BBC News that he'd begged for help and was willing to leave the UK. Frank Ospina, who was 39, died within a month of being locked up, even though, according to his family, he had no existing mental health problems. Here's our Home Affairs correspondent, Tom Simons.
5,000 miles from London, a family is mourning.
He wanted to return to Colombia to continue his work. He was a civil engineer, a professional.
The sister and brother-in-law of Frank Ospina are bewildered by his death in a British immigration detention centre, but they're sure he wasn't an asylum seeker.
He said he could pay his ticket out, but they said he would stay there for months.
They say he was in the UK to visit his mother before studying in Spain, but he was caught working illegally and sent to the detention centres at Heathrow. They believe his mental health was fine when he went in, but it went rapidly downhill.
He didn't ask for help, he begged for help. And he was begging for help not only to us, but also to the people there, like the guards.
On March the 26th, he was found dead. His family have been told he took his own life. They believe a critical factor was being detained. Immigration removal centres are where the government holds people it expects to deport. The government's toughened the law. One change, it'll be removing more migrants who use deception to come to the UK, small boats, for example. It says these centres are essential to that policy, so they will be filling up. 6 years ago, the BBC secretly filmed abuse of detainees at a different detention centre at Gatwick. A public inquiry reports next week, highly significant because 6 years on, doctors who examine detainees are warning the way they're treated is making poor mental health worse.
In detention, the first recourse is often to increase custodial processes.
So put them in a cell?
Put them in a cell, put them with somebody watching them, or frequent intrusive checks, which are not by a health professional, they're by a custodial member of staff.
In the last year, Medical Justice assessed 66 detainees in 6 centres, including this one, Harmondsworth. 13 had attempted suicide, and one factor stood out: the lack of a release date.
That kind of sudden nature of detention and the indefinite nature of detention can really be a crisis in their mental health and really can cause a great deal of stress and exacerbation of any current mental health problems.
This man, who spent time in detention, says the system is getting tougher. At one point, he was due to be sent to Rwanda.
I haven't done any crime. I didn't murder anyone. I didn't rape anyone or assaulted anyone. I don't know why I was treated this way. Great Britain is supposed to be the greatest country in the world.
The Home Office said its policy is to detain for the shortest period necessary, with risk assessments when detainees arrive and systems for raising subsequent concerns. It said, "Our staff are rigorously trained to ensure the safety of residents." But the family of Frank Ospina believe that if the government's locking up someone who wants to leave Britain, something may have gone wrong. Tom Simons, BBC News, Harmondsworth.
The Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer has said if he becomes Prime Minister, he'll work closely with the European Union to, as he put it, smash the gangs who bring people across the Channel in small boats. He's in The Hague to visit the EU's law enforcement agency Europol, which Britain left after Brexit. He's been talking to our home editor Mark Easton.
Now, everybody knows we need a returns agreement. The Prime Minister himself has acknowledged that we need a returns agreement, and that would have to be negotiated.
But already, opponents of yours are saying any kind of deal like that would mean, tens of thousands, more than 100,000 asylum seekers being dumped in Britain.
Yeah, but that's nonsense. That is embarrassing nonsense from the government, and they know it. And if they hadn't lost control of the borders, some of what they say might have some credibility. But I think if you look at the last few years, almost every decision they've taken on this issue has led to the problem getting even worse than it was before. So I think many people watching this would say to the government, stop the nonsense and get on with fixing the problem of your making.
And Mark Easton joins me from The Hague. So tell us more, Mark. Keir Starmer wanting to work more closely with the EU.
Yes, Jane, I think the Labour leader is very clear that he thinks the way to stop the boats, to smash those smuggling and trafficking gangs, is to have a closer, not a more distant relationship with the European Union. This morning he met with directors of Europol and he came out saying that, look, I'm sure we can negotiate a better arrangement with Europol that means that we'll have better intelligence, that our officers will be able to work faster and more closely with Europol officers in our fight against the transnational smuggling gangs that are operating. Now, of course, there will be those who voted for Brexit who fear that this may be a sign that Labour is prepared to betray the results of that referendum and is looking to have a much closer relationship with the European all around. And equally, there will be people in his own party and outside who will be hoping perhaps that this is a sign that Labour will want to rejoin the EU at some stage. Sir Keir Starmer says it's neither of those.
All right, Mark Easton, for now, thank you. Now, payments made with cash have risen for the first time in a decade in this country. Although new figures from the banking trade body UK Finance show we are still most likely to pay for things with a debit card. Let's find out more from our cost of living correspondent, Kevin Peachy. Cash then not completely dead then, Kevin?
No, cash is no longer king, Jane, but I think it's not ready to abdicate entirely quite yet, because these figures show that the number of payments made with notes and coins rose by 7% last year compared with the previous year. That's the first time in a decade we've seen a rise. Why? Well, two main reasons, I think. The first is that as we came out of the pandemic, people had more opportunity to spend money. But the second, and most significantly, I think, is the rising cost of living put pressure on people's finances, and people often find it easier to budget using notes and coins because they see what's coming in, what's going out and so on. But as you say, this whole payments picture is still dominated by debit cards. They account for a half of all payments. That's the first time that's happened. And it's more frequent smaller payments. So commuters, for example, are paying for individual journeys rather than just once for a season ticket, annual or monthly season ticket. So into the future, while the banks expect those debit card use to continue to rise, for cash to decline again. And that's why the government's really looking to try and support cash, various bits of legislation coming in that should protect access to cash, either withdrawing it or depositing it. And as a result, I think cash is going to be with us for a little while yet.
All right, Kevin, thank you. Kevin Peachy. The only NHS-funded helpline in England for people coming off antidepressants is closing. The health service is to stop funding the Bristol Tranquilizer project, which also helps people reduce their reliance on other medication. NHS England suggests support should be provided locally. More than 8 million adults in this country took an antidepressant last year. Rachel Schwerer has this report.
Good afternoon, Bristol Tranquilizer project.
This is the Bristol Tranquilizer project. Despite its name, the helpline takes calls from people all over the UK who are struggling to come off prescription drugs. And half of those calls are from people on antidepressants. It's the only NHS-funded phone support service in England to do this.
So what usually happens is by the time people come to us, they've exhausted the medical profession. They are in extreme distress.
Symptoms of withdrawal can include an increase in psychological distress, as well as physical symptoms like dizziness, fatigue and shaking. Earlier this year, Jane spoke to BBC Panorama. She'd been told the helpline's NHS funding was being withdrawn. It will close at the end of September. 8 million adults now take an antidepressant in England. As many as 1 in 4 of them might experience noticeable withdrawal symptoms. In recent years, the NHS and other health bodies have said services should be provided to support people going through antidepressant withdrawal. Angela is one of the service's volunteers, but 20 years ago, she was also one of its clients.
I mean, I thought I was going crazy. It wasn't really until I found the Bristol Tranquilizer project that, you know, it all started to fit.
Now she's worked with hundreds of clients and says their experiences today mirror her own.
You'd be amazed at how many people there are out there.
The local NHS body that funded the helpline said the project was commissioned to provide support for people in Bristol, even though it does in fact take calls from around the country. Now, a cross-party group in Parliament is calling for a formal national helpline to support people coming off prescribed drugs.
It's astonishing that the health service does not provide support to people who've been harmed by the very drugs that they've taken as prescribed through the same health service.
As the Bristol Tranquilizer project shuts its doors at the end of this month, some of its volunteers, including Angela, are looking to set up a new helpline. But crucially, it will be funded by private donations, not by the NHS. Rachel Schreyer, BBC News.
A man has been arrested in Spain on suspicion of sexual assault after he appeared to touch a female reporter's bottom while she was broadcasting live on a street in Madrid. An on-air confrontation followed. The incident continues a public debate in the country about sexism in the wake of Spain winning the Women's Football World Cup. Now, from flooding and droughts to sewage and plastic pollution, there are many issues facing our country's rivers. Now, to try to tackle some of that, a river in Somerset has been reconnected to its original floodplain to help mitigate the impact of climate change. John Maguire has been to see the pioneering project.
Our beautiful countryside has been shaped by centuries of agriculture, with straightened rivers and regularly shaped fields. But here at the Hunnicutt estate on the edge of Exmoor, and for the first time in the UK on this scale, the National Trust is turning back the clock, filling in a 1 kilometre stretch of the River Aller and allowing the water to find its own course across open land.
This illustrates pretty well how the scheme works. This part of the river hasn't been changed. It's straight, the banks are quite deep, albeit not a lot of water in the river at the moment, but in winter it'll really fly through here as the water flows down. So let me show you what difference the new work has made. Where the channel has been filled in, the water's finding its own way, reconnecting the river with its floodplain, they say. Already, in only the 4 or 6 weeks since the work was completed, lots and lots of greenery and an abundance of wildlife. The project has been very, very successful.
It's almost like a Control-Alt-Delete-Reset of a river system, and this project really delivers on a broad range of benefits. So it helps reduce flooding downstream. As you can see, it's really dry at the moment, but this site's really wet, so it holds water in the landscape. It sequesters carbon. As you can see today, it's amazing for wildlife, and hopefully over time it'll help us engage people with nature as well. So I think with this type of river restoration, you get a lot of bang for your buck.
This is what the site looked like last autumn. The wet summer has worked wonders ever since. The logs you can see mimic the dead wood that would be found naturally in a wetland environment. And one ambition is to allow the estate's wild beavers to inhabit this area. Early signs are showing immediate improvements to the local wildlife and the water's cleanliness. But the team here believes this, or versions of it, can help to reduce the biggest threat we face: climate change, a major cause that may be helped by allowing water to find its own course. John Maguire, BBC News.
And that takes us to a look at the weather prospects. Chris Fawkes is here. Hello.
Hi, Jane. We've got a real mixed picture to take you through the rest of the day today. For Scotland and Northern Ireland, it's a day of sunny spells and a few passing showers. The south of England, warm sunshine, feeling a little on the humid side. And between and betwixt, we've got a weather front across Wales, Midlands, stretching into Lincolnshire. Kind of tug of war between these two separate areas of low pressure. That front is not going to move through the day today. But as this low pressure starts to develop and move towards Spain and Portugal, where it could cause some severe thunderstorms, what it will do is push warmer air across England and Wales tomorrow, and it will also control how much rain we see into the weekend, as we'll see in a moment. For the afternoon, though, the wettest areas, Wales, across the Midlands, Lincolnshire, might see some of that rain into parts of northwest England, but right towards the end of the afternoon. The rain tending to turn a bit heavier as well. Warm sunshine in the south, blustery conditions for the north of Scotland, with strong winds continuing here for a time. Now, overnight tonight, our weather front changes its mind and starts working its way back northwards, with the rain returning across northern England, reaching Northern Ireland and southern Scotland by the end of the night. Quite cool air in the far north. Otherwise, for most, temperatures into double figures. Now, tomorrow, that weather front's still with us. It's going to be bringing some fairly heavy rain across the far north of England into Northern Ireland and parts of Scotland as well. To the south of that, increasingly, we'll see dry and sunny weather. But underneath that cloud and rain for northern areas, these temperatures a little on the low side for the time of year, 14, 15 degrees, not feeling great. Whereas in the south, across England and Wales, we're looking at highs 21 to 25 degrees Celsius, so a warmer day and starting to feel a bit more humid as well. Now, that weather front will be quite weak by the time we get into the weekend. Just a few spots of rain, probably around southern Scotland, northern England, maybe into parts of Wales too. Further southwards, sunshine turning a bit hazier. 1 or 2 thundery showers are possible towards the south. At the same time, we'll have this cooler air for Scotland, Northern Ireland, with sunny spells and just a few showers for the far north of Scotland. So again, quite a mixed picture. It's by Sunday that we start to see some heavier rain flicked up by that area of low pressure in the south. Now, there's some uncertainty about where this heavy thundery rain exactly goes, but it could go as far north as parts of Scotland even. The rain potentially heavy enough to cause 1 or 2 issues, maybe some localised flooding around. Still quite humid across southern areas. We've still got that fresh air across the far north of the UK. Taking a quick peek briefly into next week, well, it looks unsettled. It looks like next week is going to be generally quite a wet and windy week as well. So a mixed picture this afternoon, Jane.
All right, Chris, thank you very much. And that is the BBC News at 1 for today. You can keep up to date with all our stories on our website, of course, and the news continues here on BBC One, because we'll join our colleagues for the news wherever you are. Have a very good afternoon. Bye-bye.